Good evening. Welcome to another show on Africa and leadership. It's always great to have you with us from wherever you are watching across Africa and way beyond as well. Now, this week we host economist Dr. Ayodele Odusola, based with the United Nations Development Programme. He shares his views on development in Africa. We also get to hear your views on the issues. And we have Africa's Top 10. You're watching the Africa Leadership Dialogues. I am Julie Gichuru. Dr. Ayodele Odusola works with the United Nations Development Programme and is based in New York. Prior to this, he worked at the National Center for Economic Management and Administration in Ibadan, Nigeria, where he distinguished himself in training and research. Before his posting to New York, he worked with the United Nations Development Programme in Nigeria and in South Africa as country director. So what are his views on development and economic growth in Africa? Let's take a look. Thank you so much, Ayo, for making time to be with the Africa Leadership Dialogues. Now, there's been lots of talk about the MDGs and focus on achieving as much as possible by 2015. There's a whole issue of the post-2015 agenda, which we'll come to. Let's start with the MDGs in Africa. Some people feeling that the MDGs were not crafted internally, were brought to Africa. Other people saying, listen, these are serious targets and positive targets. What's your take on the whole debate?
Well, as the MDG advisor for UNDP in Africa, I think what is most important is for us to see how relevant is UNDP to Africa. It is true in the 90s when the idea was conceived, many Africans were not really brought onto the table. But eventually, what we got ended up being a kind of rallying point for development issues. There's hardly any of the goals that is not relevant to Africa. The real issue for us to really address is the relevance of the MDGs. And to this end, I will confidently say, based on my experience across all African countries and what is happening across the world, that there has never been any global goal that has rallied development attention among development actors than the MDG over the past 50 decades. I mean, the existence of the Global Development Framework. Right. And we thought on the basis of that, it has directed development actors, policymakers, and even politicians towards a set of targets. The issue is for us to see how best we can use it to further mobilize development actions toward development outcomes in Africa. You know,
on that note, and you've just mentioned, it really did rally and focus the efforts, to the advantage of many developed countries, and some say to the exclusion of developing countries, but to the exclusion, some say, of the developed world. But also there's the issue of some Asian states seem to have embraced it and really risen to the challenge. And it may not be the case across Africa. What's your observations of the performance of African states? Who's done well? Who's lagged behind? How can we improve?
Yeah, you see, let me just start from the clarity of the issues. Okay. The first thing relates to the initial conditions. At times, it's difficult for us to compare Africa with Latin America, with Asia, because at the time the MDG was conceived, the Latin Americans as well as the Asians are on the trajectory of rising development. They were already rising. And most African countries in the 90s were more or less, falling through the trough of development cycle. And at that stage, it's difficult for us to really say, let us compare Africa with Asia or Latin America. Now, the main thing is that in spite of that, if you look at the kind of where we were then and where we are today, and the number of countries that have made progress, the last assessment we did globally, out of 20 countries in the world, they were able to make very fast improvement in at least 12 targets, right? Out of the 20 countries, 15 are from Africa.
Wow.
So And that is it. And if you check some of the things we've been doing in the past in terms of who are the rebel risers, that is, who are those countries that are really blazing the trail on development in terms of performance? African countries are really on top. And I want to just give an example. For instance, the kind of performance we have in Africa varies across the goals and targets. It is true there is not a single country that we can say categorically that have achieved all the MDGs. But there has been tremendous improvement. Now, you can think about a low-income country like Niger Republic. Now, of all the countries in the world, there is hardly any country that has been able to move and accelerate enrollment in primary schools up to the level Niger has done. It's true, it's still very low relative to where we are going. But if you compare it with where it was in 2000, it has improved enrollment in primary school more than 100%.
Let me ask you this, Ayo. That's incredible. We didn't know this. So let me pose this question to you. Why are we as Africans so hard on ourselves? Why do we not pat ourselves on the back when we start doing things right? Is it a mindset?
Well, I wouldn't blame us as Africans in terms of that. Our expectations are high.
Which is a good thing.
It's a good thing, which is good. And at the same time, like I said, we tend to compare ourselves with what is happening in other regions of the world, but not knowing that we did not start at the same level. And we do not expect, for those of us that have been following the discussions on the issue of development and the MDGs, we know that, for instance, #1 country in the world in terms of the number of women in national parliament is Africa. It's Rwanda.
It's Rwanda,
56%.
right here. East
There's
Africa.
no other country in the world that has gone so far. So that's it. And there are many other countries that have gone beyond the 30% of women in national parliament. We have many of them. South Africa is there over 45%.
It's a constitutional requirement in Kenya.
Constitutional requirement. There are a lot of things that are taking it that way. But one thing which I want to probably emphasize is that it's good for Africans to have high expectations about their leaders. And the reason is this, is because of historical antecedents. Before the crafting of the MDGs, many of our leaders were more or less laid back in terms of development issues. They were not seriously concerned about the improved living conditions of the people. But it's on the basis of the experience we had during the structural adjustment program that made people to be a bit despair and probably hopeless about what's going to come out. But at the end, we ended up having something quite better. For instance, we never thought that HIV would be reversed. We've succeeded in reversing HIV in the entire continent. And the number of people that are living with ARV has improved tremendously than any other region, though the highest burden is here. Again, the level of improvement is quite remarkable. And that if you see the kind of improvement across countries on issues relating to Goal 2, increasing the enrollment in primary schools, now almost all countries are moving in the right direction. Almost all countries are moving. Now, I know we have some kind of challenges in the area of health-related goals, especially child mortality and maternal mortality. But if you see the kind of improvement over the recent statistical releases, it's been quite tremendous. For instance, we've gotten about 47% reduction in child mortality rate, which is remarkable. If you look at the average,
significant.
There are some countries that have gone so far in terms of reaching it. There are some countries that are quite below. But in terms of average movement, where most of the countries are going and the direction, we're moving in the right trajectory.
So looking at so it's a good thing to be hard on ourselves. It's a good thing to have high expectations, but we must also recognize that progress is being made. Post 2015. Now, reframing the whole discussion, do you think are the areas of most critical interest for Africa? And there's a little bit of debate and discussion still around this issue. So what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. Well, incidentally, I happen to be the one coordinating post-2015 development agenda on behalf of UNDP for Africa. And let me just tell you, you see, because we are so much too hard on ourselves, of all the regions working within the UN, Africa happened to be the first region that initiated the consultation on post-2015 development agenda region-wide. Now, it is true we're not yet there. But again, Africa is the only continent of any developing region that has a draft common position on post-2015.
Which has just been released, and yes.
So, and again, we are the only region that has set up high-level committee on post-2015 development agenda, outside the high-level panel that was set by the UN Secretary General. Again, this is more or less a sign of commitment. I think we have to give kudos to our leaders in terms of getting their acts together, in terms of having a common position.
If I'm not mistaken, this particular drive is being led by Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia.
Yes.
Is representing Africa on this. Okay. So looking at the particular sectors or areas that you think Africa needs to ensure are captured in this agenda, what would you say the top three are?
Now, the emerging issues on Africa are in 5 areas. But let me just mention a few. The first one relates to the issue of peace and security. In fact, there is hardly any of the national consultations we had and the regional consultation we had where that was not considered to be the priority attention. That it is true there can never be growth where there is insecurity and instability. And there is need for us to secure that. That's number one. The second issue relates to the issue of governance. In fact, building our institutions and making sure we have a kind of open and transparent institutions that governs the public affairs is very critical in Africa, and I think that should be very important. Now, the idea is for us to see, okay, how can we have effective, open and transparent society and institution? That is very, very important. Now, there is one thing they talk about, economic transformation. And this is an area which I think we need to have some kind of deeper reflection. There are 3 elements there. The issue of food security.
Food security and our, yes.
Now, the other element relates to the issue of industrialization. It is true we cannot continue to be exporting primary commodities, be it agricultural commodities or natural resources, and that we need to add value to it. They emphasize the need to develop the value chain of the production system, because that is the one that is likely to generate more jobs and create more wealth for the people. The third element of the structural transformation relates to infrastructural development. With the exception of Africa, the infrastructure deficit, South Africa, the infrastructure deficit of the continent is quite huge. In fact, it was estimated to be about $90 billion on an annual basis in terms of if you want to do it for a period of about 10 to 15 years, you have to spend about $90 billion annually on that. And there's need for us to look into that. Now, there is one thing that cut across not the demographics, is that we must complete the unfinished business of the MDGs. In fact, there was none of the national consultation that did not mention that, including the regional consultation. And here, we're talking about human development and capacity building and strengthening. And it focuses on issues relating to quality service in education, health, water, and sanitation. And I think that the social anchor of the MDG must be strengthened and must be deepened. And that these are the critical things they thought, oh, there's need for us to have a deeper reflection on this. Now, on the last component, relates to the issue of climate change. Now, we may not understand it to be climate change within the general populace, but everybody knows the impact of drought, the impact of flood or erosion, and that the need for them to make sure those things are tied to their economic well-being, and that there is need for us to really look into that in terms of how strategic are we in terms of adapting to the climate and the changing environment.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
There's a word I want to touch on. It's development speak of sorts, and it's this word inclusiveness.
Yes.
And everybody talks about, ensuring that, we are inclusive on economic growth and all the rest of it. And Africans are sitting back in their villages and in their homes, wondering, and in the cities and towns, wondering, what on earth does this mean to me?
Great.
How do you plan to change my life with this inclusiveness, and when will these changes happen?
Thank you very much. I really love that because that has been one of the anchors of my development work. And when we talk about inclusive growth, now let me just use a small analogy for this. There are many countries in Africa that have experienced growth, but the growth is not translating into improved living conditions and quality of life for the people. And we thought there's a disconnect. And that it is true growth is being generated, but that growth is not inclusive. We mean inclusive growth in about 2 to 3 dimensions. The first one is that for growth to be inclusive, it must be a growth that is rich in job. It must be able to create decent job. I'm not talking about vulnerable jobs. Jobs that will be comfortable and everybody will be proud of being part of.
Dignified jobs.
Dignified job. That is the first element. Now, for growth to be inclusive, it must take place in a sector that is purely dominated by the poor people. We know agriculture employs 60 to 70% of Africans. Now, we've been saying there has been growth in agriculture, but it's not reflected in their well-being and income of the people. Meaning, most of the growth may not be real in that sense. It may be nominal growth. There's growth in it, but nominal. But for it to be real and inclusive, it must be something that translates into the well-being of the people. Let me just tell you one thing. In 1987, in Nigeria, when the first liberalization of the foreign exchange market was done, the economic liberalization. Now, there were some set of farmers who were planting cocoa. And because of the astronomical change in exchange rate, you know what happened? The farmers started buying the Evolution. It's one of the latest Peugeot car in Nigeria then. They started buying Evolution. That was a kind of transmission mechanism between the adjustment and the life and the well-being of the people. But in a situation where you say a sector is growing and the people operating in the sector, and there's no evidence of improvement in their life.
In fact, very often we see farmers locked in a cycle of poverty.
That is it. That is what we want to avoid. And inclusive growth must be able to break that dynamics, remove the cycle of poverty and make sure that it is translated in their quality of life. They're able to send their children to school, they're able to attend medical services, and they're able to do a lot of dignified things that enhances their well-being. And again, the plan for the future. Now, the other element relates to the fact that, okay, for growth to be inclusive, people must be the beginning and the end of the growth process. Let me explain. Now, we should not see people as a factor, just an honorary tool in the production process. They should be an agent of the growth process and maybe the beneficiary of the growth itself. Now, that's the failure of the market. The market can do a lot of things, but the market doesn't know how to distribute wealth. Now, if the growth is generated and the resources of the growth, the end result of the growth is used to benefit those that are marginalized in the society, that is an inclusive growth.
So how do you do this in agriculture? Is this via cooperatives where you have greater power, you leverage, you have stronger say at the negotiating tables, you agree on prices, you standardize? How do farmers do this?
There are a lot of it. That's what we call, what the UNDP is doing, called the MDG Acceleration Framework. That framework is aimed at identifying the key bottlenecks to MDG acceleration and at the same time getting some kind of local solution to move them forward. Now, we've done it on food security. I'm citing this example because you mentioned agriculture. There are many things you can do in that. From the distribution side, many farmers do not have access to fertilizers. Why don't you subsidize it? Make sure the process and the institutions of distributing fertilizer effectively is done.
This is a huge debate in Africa.
I know.
Yes.
That's why I said effective.
Yes.
Now, that is one option. But if you think you do not have the capacity to do that, why don't you strengthen the network of farmers, the associations? Because the associations will definitely do it better than when the public sector does it. So strengthen their capacity to be able to do this and let them do that. You can have a kind of what we call a kind of agricultural development fund The idea is that African farmers are not saying they don't want to borrow. They want to borrow, but nobody recognizes them in the financial market. Why don't you create institutions that allow them to borrow at a cheaper rate so that it will not force them to increase the price unduly? That is part of it. Now, many Africans, you and I, and even those that are younger than us, don't want to go into agriculture because we still use our hoes and cutlasses.
It's just not cool.
It's not.
It's not. Yes.
It's not. So the idea is that why don't you make those equipment available that will be enticing to young people to join the farming system? When I was very young in my country, very young, I'm talking when I was about 10 years or something, we're talking about up to middle 70s. Now, I grew up to know what they call the agricultural settlements. The agricultural settlement is what the government goes to a particular virgin area and take about 1,000 hectares of land or more, and then say, okay, this must be partitioned to about 100 young farmers. There is a settlement. You have houses for them, market is created, all the equipment there, irrigation is there, let them stay. Now, if you do that, if a young man or woman will be interested in doing that rather than hanging over in cities without a job,
we could transform our economies.
That is
yes,
it.
Absolutely.
Now, those are the kind of things we can do, and that's an inclusive growth because of the distribution anchor of it.
Let's talk about the leadership Africa needs to reignite programs that existed. And then we won't even go into the discussion of what happened to programs like that. But what kind of leadership does Africa need today in this dynamic world, where we still have a lot of challenges, but huge opportunities as well?
Let me just tell you that there are internal and external factors to leadership issues. It is true some Africans are genuine in getting real development in place. But the kind of political milieu and the environment they find themselves has really incapacitated them, and they couldn't do anything. Now, the issue is we need very strong leaders who are committed to development. The issue is not about politics, it's about development. But again, nobody says there's development without politics, but it has to be balanced. Now, we need to have a kind of long-term vision of the development horizon of each country, and our leaders must be able to note that. And that should be the basis of negotiation or discussion with any actors, whether within or outside. You want me to do this? How do you contribute into this long-term development issue? Those are the type of leaders we want. Two, we want leaders that should be able to call the shot when the time comes.
They must be able to take the tough decisions, lead from the front, you're saying.
Yes.
Let me ask you, I will ask you to wind up by looking at the camera and give your message to the African public. But before you do that, you've worked in Africa. You are working outside of Africa right now, based in New York. Just a few decades ago, it was rather embarrassing and painful to be an African in certain situations. You sit and your aura is depleted. You feel like, so my question to you is, compare working in your environment 15 years ago to what you feel today. What's the difference and what's fed into this difference? If any.
There are differences anyway.
Okay.
So, before what we started experiencing about 3-4 years ago, everything about Africa in the global arena was seen within a doom picture. It was a state of hopelessness. And that at times as Africans you feel, ashamed in some situation. But some of us, stood by our feet.
Stood tall,
yeah,
in spite of this, yes.
But you see, because of the global financial crisis that came in 2007, the reality became glaring to everybody. That in spite of the fact that many parts of the world are facing the burden of the global crisis, Africa remained resilient. While they were declining their growth profile, some of the African countries have been growing. And, today, Africa remains the second fastest growing nation in the world. Two, between 2012 and 2014, 29 countries were projected to as the fastest growing economies in the world. 16 of them are from Africa. This is a sign of hope. Now, you've seen the lion is racing. Oh, the sleeping giant has woken up. A lot of things have been written about Africa, the Africa golden age, meaning that they have realized the potentials in Africa. Globally, it was a kind of politics anyway. It was realized before, but the crisis made it quite obvious to the extent that they knew that because of the resilience we went through while other countries of the world are facing crises, most of the African countries, because of our limited engagement in globalization, we were a bit insulated. And that gave us the right footing to start tall. And that's one of the issues.
And you've pointed out the critical factor because of our limited engagement, which saved us, but in essence was not necessarily a positive thing in itself, but a new era for Africa?
Yes, new era for Africa. I see Africa, it's been projected that Africa's economy will overtake many of the regions, other developing regions, by 2020. And on the basis of this, for us to really accomplish it, there are a number of things we need to do. We need to develop confidence in ourselves, because without that, nobody is going to build it for you unless you stand your feet on some of these things. 2, we have to encourage our leaders to do the right thing and be visionary. 3, the citizens themselves need to play their role, the civic engagement. They have to be the whistleblower for the government. The government cannot watch over its shoulders. We need to do that. And that's why we need to develop civil society organizations to be up to the task. Now, development is not the responsibility of any single actor. It is a collaborative effort across the various stakeholders. The private sector should serve as the engine of growth, and they should be given the enabling environment to really operate effectively and to be able to contribute meaningfully to Africa's growth and development.
Wow, thank you. And having said all that, please look into the camera and give the many Africans watching your message.
My compatriots, the message is very clear. Africa has initiated the process of growth. We should all support the continent to consolidate on the growth process. We should find a way of making sure we translate our growth into development that impact positively on the people. There should be no reason why we should have people living in abject poverty in Africa. We have the resources to do it. Whatever it takes, we need to put all our hands on the table and let's roll up our sleeve and let's move into action. Africa will definitely rise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hands on deck. Hands on deck. Asante sana. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
Elsie Kanza from Tanzania says, as we mourn the end of an era, a giant legacy, why can't any one of you be the mark or spark of the next era? It must be. I believe in you, and the legacy must live on. Heartfelt condolences to Madiba's loved ones, our South African sisters and brothers, and all of us who are touched by his leadership. Keep the flame of hope and change alive. It is our duty. A luta continua.
Dumiso Lutuli from South Africa says, he lives. If we emulate his example in whatever small way, if we keep to the commitments we have made, he shall forever live. If he dies, we will have to shoulder a fair part of the blame.
Magi Kigozi from Uganda says, our hero is resting. He did his part. Although he deserves to rest after an incredible life, fighting for the freedom of others, both black and white, I am sad.
Mema Beye from Mali says, as we say in Mali, may the earth be kind to his body, may his soul shine bright in the sky as a guide to his fellows. I pray and hope that his humility, ability to forgive, to treat all human beings with dignity, courtesy and respect will permeate into our hearts the same way the pain of his departure has affected us. That each one of us will strive even harder to internalize the lessons of his life and make his attitude and values part of our future behaviors. As we pay tribute to the late Nelson Mandela, we asked you, what epitomizes true leadership? George Jabier says, the epitome of true leadership is selflessness and integrity.
Wairimo Wayaki says, it all begins in the heart. Love. Without love, where do you even begin? A heart with love can then lead by putting others above self and being an extension of God's hand.
My name is Ayodele Odusola from Nyeri, Kenya. I'd like to join my fellow Kenyans and the world at large to celebrate the life of an icon, a hero, a kingsman, and an inspiration to many, the late Nelson Mandela. True leadership, as exhibited by the late Mandela, circles around perseverance, diligence in service, human and forgiving heart, undying passion and determination, a quest to empower all, and most importantly, putting God first. I can only compare the late Nelson Mandela to a beehive. He looked like he was not capable and fighting a losing battle. But after a long struggle, what came out of it was something more sweeter than honey, something that everybody in the world wants to be associated with. You will forever remain in our hearts. Rest in peace, Nelson Mandela.
True leader is hard to find because a true leader understands three things. Number one, you understand your position. You understand that you're called to serve the greater good. You represent a people with needs, and you are a voice to the voiceless. You are a defender to the defenseless. You need to understand your position as a leader. Number two, you need to understand the influence and the power that you carry. You should be able to use this power to benefit the people who you represent. You are there not for yourself, you are there for people, that you have a lot of power. It is within you to control their welfare, their future, and their destinies. And number three, and most importantly, then in understanding this position and the power that you yield, you are able to, with great humility, execute this mandate diligently and consistently the best way you know how.
To join our conversation, go to our G+ page, Africa Leadership Dialogues, on Facebook, Africa Leadership Dialogues, on Twitter, @AfricaLD, and on WhatsApp, send your video comments to +254 715 816 033.
As always, it's a great pleasure to hear from you. Do keep sharing your views on various platforms. We appreciate the engagement. Now to Africa's Top 10.
To celebrate the life of former South African President, Nobel Peace Prize winner and global leadership icon, the late Nelson Mandela, here are 10 quotes that embody the advice and observations of a man who devoted his life to the service of humanity. At number 10 is, overcoming poverty is not a task of charity, it is an act of justice. Like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It is man-made and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. At number 9 is, there is no passion to be found playing small in settling for a life that is less than the one you are capable of living. At number 8 is, no one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For loves come more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. At number 7 is, if you want to make peace with your enemy, you have to work with your enemy. Then he becomes your partner. At number 6 is, there is no easy walk to freedom anywhere, and many of us will have to pass through the valley of the shadow of death again and again before we reach the mountain top of our desires. At number 5 is, there were many dark moments when my faith in humanity was sorely tested, but I will not and could not give myself up to despair. That way lays defeat and death. At number 4 is, I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear. At number 3 is, There is nothing like returning to a place that remains unchanged to find the ways in which you yourself have altered. At number 2 is, sometimes it falls on a generation to be great. You can be that great generation. Let your greatness blossom. And at number 1 is, it always seems impossible until it is done. Rest in peace, Nelson Mandela. That's Africa's Top 10 this week.
We've come to the close of the show. We leave you with the words of Tanzania's Julius Nyerere. And he said, "Independence cannot be real if a nation depends upon gifts." Food for thought. Blessings to you and blessings to Africa. I'll see you again next week.